Amen. Dear friends, welcome back to our weekly readings from the Desert Fathers. Let us sing a prayer and we will continue. O heavenly King, comforter the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasury of good things and giver of life, come and dwell in us and cleanse us of all impurity, and save our souls, O good one. So we've been blessed now for a number of weeks reading the sayings of the Desert Fathers, and I think getting a tremendous amount of benefit from this reading, for which, of course, we are very grateful to the Desert Fathers for leaving us this heritage behind that we can draw so much benefit from and get so much use from. Today, we will read Abba John the Persian. I think Isidore the Priest we already finished. And I would like to say one thing that we read last week, or even maybe, I think last week. We started with Abba James, who said, "It is better to receive hospitality than to offer it." And I spent a good amount of time actually sort of pondering on what that could have meant and why, Abba said it like that. And came to the realization that most likely it has to do with the fact that when you're offering hospitality, you are taking the responsibility for your guests. And it's a two-edged sword, double-edged sword, you might say. Because on the one hand, you should offer the best that you have, because you should not be stingy, and you should give your guests everything that is best, including wine. But on the other hand, giving your guests everything that is best, including wine, may actually pose a temptation for your guests. And thus, as one offering hospitality, you find yourself in a much more difficult situation because you can't tell what your guests are going to do. Now, if you're receiving hospitality, it's much easier because you could thank the host and take what it is that you consider appropriate for yourself from what is being offered, including wine. You could drink only as much as you consider necessary, and then you're fine. But if you're offering hospitality, in some cases, you feel obliged by sort of the laws of hospitality to offer more wine, more food, which then presents sometimes a real temptation for the one to whom this hospitality is being offered. And because of that, obviously, that's why this particular saint, that would have been Abba James, that's why he said that it is better to receive hospitality than to offer it. Because when you're receiving, when you say, no thank you, this is enough for me, that's where it ends. But when you're offering, sometimes you offer and your guests would like to accept it, but they are trying to be humble. And so there's this back and forth and so on. And you don't often know very well when to stop, when to say, okay, I don't have to offer anymore. So that's just something to sort of revisit what we read before. Meanwhile, today, the first chapter of Abba John the Persian is as follows. A demoniac boy came one day to be healed, and some brothers from an Egyptian monastery arrived. As one old man was coming out to meet them, he saw brothers sinning with a boy, but he did not accuse him. He said, "If God, who has made them, sees them and does not burn them, who am I to blame them?" So, that's probably one of the most difficult texts to comment on. However, I think maybe best, rather than give our imagination, sort of free rein and end up thinking some horrible, horrible things, it's probably best to say that, well, whatever occurred between these two, the demoniac boy and some monk from Egypt, whatever happened between them, this particular monastic considered that he is not the one to blame them because God is not burning them. Now, you might say that, well, God doesn't really burn anyone, so why is it that, when should we speak? And that's another major consideration. When do we speak against a sin of a brother? I would dare say that probably the best rule of thumb is to say we should only speak out against the sin of a brother in the event that we are certain that our speaking out will bring about the brother's repentance, conversion, and salvation. If we go about accusing everybody and condemning everybody, we are not helping them, because in some cases we're making them defensive, and actually in some cases we help the sin to get deeper rooted in them, because when they are fighting against us, they're justifying their own sinful behavior. And also it would be inappropriate for us to do it if it's not our direct responsibility. That is where the clergy and the laity have a significant difference. As a laity, a person, as a layman or a laywoman, a person can say, well, this is not my child, this is not my spouse, this is not my responsibility, and can keep walking, which is exactly what this monk did. He was not the spiritual father. He was not a confessor. He probably, I'm not sure if he's a priest or not, possibly not. Therefore, he did not rebuke the two people that he saw sinning. However, clergy have the responsibility to instruct people and to correct people. And because of that, we are held responsible before God for bringing about the sinner's salvation. Now, it's not always possible. And there are times when even God himself does not succeed in bringing somebody about. Some people are just so obstinate and so deeply rooted in sin that even when the Lord of glory was incarnate and dwelt among them and rebuked them and spoke with them, they did not heed his rebukes, they did not heed his advice. But for us, I think perhaps sort of the best indicator is what I'm about to say. Will it help the person? Will it help the individual conquer this temptation and this sin? If it will, and it's not just something that I think, that you pretty much have to know that it will. If you only think that it will, but then it doesn't in the end, well, then obviously you have done more damage than you've done good. But if it actually does and you know that it will, then of course, or you have fairly, a high rate of certainty that it will, then you should speak up. Chapter 2. One of the fathers related of Abba John the Persian that his great charity had brought him to a profound innocence. He dwelt in Arabia of Egypt. One day he borrowed some money from a brother and bought some flax for his work. Then a brother came and asked him, Abba, give me a little flax so that I can make myself a cloak. He gave him some readily. Similarly, another brother came and asked him, give me a little flax so that I can make some cloth. So he gave him some too. Others came and asked him for things, and he simply gave them cheerfully. Later, the owner of the money came to reclaim it. The old man said to him, I will go and get it for you. Because he could not return it to him, he went to Abba James, who was a deacon, to ask him to give him some money so that he could return it to the brother. On the way, he found a coin on the ground, but he did not touch it. He said a prayer and returned to his cell. But the brother came once more, pestering him about the money. And the old man said to him, I am very worried about it. Once again he went, found the coin on the ground where it was lying, and once again he said a prayer and returned to his cell. But the brother came back and to pester him as before. The old man said to him, This time I will certainly bring it to you. Once again he got up and went to the place where the coin lay on the ground. He said a prayer and went to tell Abba James, Abba, as I was coming here, I found this coin on the road. Please make it known in the neighborhood in case someone has lost it. And if its owner is found, give it to him. So the old man went and asked about it for 3 days, but no one who had lost a piece of money came. Then the old man said to Abba James, Then if no one has lost it, give it to this brother, for I owe it to him. As I was coming to ask you for alms in order to give him his due, I found it. The old man was astonished that having a debt and finding that piece, he had not picked it up at once and given it to him. He was equally to his credit that when someone came to borrow something from Abba John, he did not give it to him himself, but said to the brother, Go and help yourself to whatever you need. And when someone brought anything back to him, he would say, Put it back where it belongs. If the borrower did not return the thing, he did not say anything to him. Now, this story, to me, I remember it actually from many, many, many years back when I read this book for the first time. It's very impressive, and it actually shows a great deal of light onto the efforts that the Desert Fathers made to acquire virtue. In this case, the virtue of sort of renunciation of material possessions. Now, we see that John the Persian was the one who owed a debt, and when he went to tell Abba James was astounded that having this debt, he didn't just take the coin and give it back to him readily, but he actually went through all the trouble. He didn't pick it up the first 2 times. The third time, he also brought it to Abba James and had him inquire if someone had lost it. And only when it was unclaimed did he actually take it and returned his debt to the brother. I imagine many of us would probably say, "Oh, praise God! That's wonderful. I found my coin, and I can return my debt. So I'm doing great. This is God's providence." We wouldn't even stop and think that potentially it belongs to someone who might have lost it, but he did. He took the time. He took the pains to see whether someone lost it and whether it needed to be returned. And in all his other dealings, you might say that he exhibited tremendous amount of love and, as they say here, charity, because he gave things away easily and he never really demanded them back. So that, in a subtle way, is a great indication to us to what extent we must acquire virtue. Often enough, we think that if we are quiet, if we don't say anything, if we sort of don't commit any grave offenses, that we're doing great, that we're doing fine. But see to what extent the Desert Fathers took their exercise of virtue, in this case, of not taking something that didn't belong to him, something that he didn't put there. And it reminds me of another story where an elder was walking with his disciple. His disciple saw something in the ground and went and picked it up right away. It might have been a vegetable or something, and I think he almost proceeded to eat it. And the elder said, "My son, did you put that there?" And of course the disciple says, "No, Father, I didn't." He says, "So why are you taking it up? Why are you picking it up? You didn't put it there. It's not yours. Don't pick it up." So that is how they behaved. Now, another thing too, sometimes, is that the enemy would actually make things look like gold, like coins, to tempt the brothers. And that is why they would never pick up gold or money that was lying on the road, because they knew very well it could be a temptation from the devil. In which case, they would be greatly mocked by the enemy if they started picking those things up. So in some cases, they would walk by gold that was lying on the side of the street and never pick it up. And this story illustrates it quite well. Chapter 3. It was said of Abba John the Persian that when some evildoers came to him, he took a basin and wanted to wash their feet. But they were filled with confusion and began to do penance. Well, So evildoers, maybe bandits or people maybe that had ill intentions, maybe they wanted to rob him or do something else to him. And he didn't try to wash their feet in order to look silly or to look more spiritual or more humble. That was his genuine expression. They came to visit him. He was going to wash their feet because they took a journey to see him living out in the desert. And the genuine humility of the elder is what affected them to such an extent. So sometimes we see people in our church nowadays sort of try acting like this, try sort of to be extra humble or sort of to go the extra mile and do some of these things. But they come across as disingenuous because, it's quite obvious these individuals attempting to do such things have not acquired that humility yet, but they're trying to act as though they have. And so therefore it's incongruent. It's not exactly real, and sort of the lack of reality of such behavior, it turns people off. And I imagine that if he did something like this just for the show, the evildoers would probably feel even more justified, acting in a way that was, malicious toward him. His humility was real, it was genuine, and that is what affected such a change in them. Chapter 4. Someone said to Abba John the Persian, "We have borne great afflictions for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Shall we inherit it?" The old man said, "As for me, I am confident I shall obtain the inheritance of Jerusalem on high, which is written in the heavens. Why should I not be confident? I have been hospitable like Abraham, meek like Moses, holy like Aaron, patient like Job, humble like David, hermit like John, filled with compunction like Jeremiah, a master like Paul, full of faith like Peter, wise like Solomon. Like the thief, I trust that he who is of his natural goodness has given me all that, will also grant me the kingdom." Now, this is quite beautiful, and I don't understand why, for some strange reason, the pronoun he is not capital in this case. It should be capital because he's obviously referring to God. But what is so beautiful about this chapter, as you read him comparing himself to all of these great Old Testament saints, you could almost think that, well, this is somebody rather conceited or, sort of high opinion of himself. But listen to how he ends all of this great list of saints whose virtues he emulated and sort of imitated to his best ability. He says, "Like the thief, I trust that he who of his natural goodness has given me all that. He has given me." So he didn't become hospitable like Abraham. God gave it to him. He didn't become meek like Moses himself. God gave it to him. So acquiring these great virtues of these great men, he acquired their humility, and he attributed such great acquisition to the grace and to the gift of God. And thus we see that his virtue is real, because sometimes when we think that we're doing well and perhaps making some progress in spiritual life, if we attribute it to our own efforts, well, we are truly conceited and deceived, I would say, to some extent, because once we come to believe that we have achieved something by our strength, we stand to lose it quite quickly. And often it happens that someone gains a certain level of sort of outwardly seemingly spiritual life, but if the person attributes that acquisition to his own efforts, to his own work, well, then that person stands to lose it very quickly. Because let's face it, St. Paul said that our struggle is not with flesh and blood, but it is with the principalities and powers and the evil spirits of the air. So obviously with the demons and the evil spirits, they are very cunning. And if we think that we have managed to gain a certain amount of victory over them by our own strength, we are in grave danger. And sometimes also, the words of the scripture may be fulfilled in us, not in the best of ways, because it says God resists the proud and he gives grace to the humble. So if acquiring virtue, we do not humble ourselves, we do not acquire humility alongside with other virtue, whether it be vigilance or attention in prayer, or whether it be fasting, or certain amount of prayers, or whatever it is that we're doing, if we attribute it to ourselves, well, the enemy will strip us of it very easily and quickly. So we must be prudent and, very much like Abba John the Persian, attribute our acquisition of virtue to the gift of God. Because if God gave it to us, then he can keep it secure, and that virtue will remain with us. Let's see. John the Theban, there's only one. The Theban basically means that he's from Thebes. It was said of young John the Theban, a disciple of Abba Amos, that he spent 12 years serving the old man when he was ill. He stayed sitting with him on his mat, but the old man did not pay much attention to him, so much so that though he worked very hard for him, he never did he say to him, "Salvation be yours." But when he was at the point of death and the old man surrounded him, he took his hand and said to him, "Salvation be yours, salvation be yours, salvation be yours." Then he entrusted him to the old man, saying, "He is an angel, not a man." Now, this is something rather interesting, and it basically talks about both the saints. Abba Amos was, either preoccupied, or he was testing John the Theban, or potentially he saw John the Theban making spiritual progress and sort of making a spiritual acquisition, and he did not want to take it away from him. What I mean by that is that possibly Abba Amos realized that not saying a kind word to John the Theban was allowing John the Theban sort of to earn something spiritually, to earn a certain amount of grace, because it is easy for us, for all of us, to be considerate, to be kind, to be generous, to be attentive, when there's gratitude for our attention, our kindness, for our prayers. When people are grateful, whether sort of materially, or they show their gratitude in other ways, they say something to us, or somehow they treat us in a way that shows us that they're grateful for our love and devotion, well, then it makes it so much easier for us to offer this love and devotion. Abba Amos didn't show any gratitude to John the Theban for 12 years, essentially. And in that time, John the Theban didn't serve him any less. He didn't care for him any less. He did everything according to his conscience, and that is why on his deathbed, Abba Amos sort of thanked him 3 times by saying, "Salvation be yours," and then gave him the highest recommendation to the elders, to the other saints, by saying, "He is an angel, not a man," because he was doing that which was right and which was good, even without getting any gratitude in return. John, disciple of Abba Paul, also has only 1 chapter. It was said of Abba John, the disciple of Abba Paul, that his obedience was very great. Now there were some tombs thereabouts where a hyena lived. The old man saw some dung in the place and told John to go and fetch it. He said, "And what shall I do about the hyena, Abba?" The old man said to him jokingly, "If she sets upon you, tie her up and bring her here." So in the evening the brother went there, and lo, the hyena fell upon him. According to the old man's instruction, he rushed to catch her, but the hyena ran away. He pursued her, saying, "My Abba says, I'm to tie you up." He seized her and bound her. Now the old man was uneasy and sat waiting for him. When he returned, he brought the hyena on a rope. When the old man saw this, he was filled with wonder, but he wanted to humiliate him. So he struck him and said, "Fool, why have you brought a silly dog here?" Then the old man set her free at once and let her go. Now, you see, this is something, and especially if you are sort of in the position of a disciple, do keep this in mind. This is very important. Sometimes your teacher, sometimes your sort of senior, sometimes your superior will actually marvel at your obedience, will sort of be struck with wonder by your performance, but for your own benefit, so as not to let you get conceited and become proud. He might say something, that sort of nullifies your efforts and make you look silly. Don't be dejected and don't be downcast. Never give up. Never quit. Don't think for a moment that somehow you are not loved or not cared for. I do remember reading about the Optina elders, and I think that the spiritual father of Macarius of Optina once, when Macarius came into the room, chased him out and humiliated him and said something to him. And Macarius, of course, Elder Macarius obeyed and said, "Yes, yes, Father, of course, by all means," and walked out of the room and went to do whatever he was asked. And then to the people who were in the room, his elder said, "No one has, grown spiritually as much as Father Macari has. No one has his humility. No one has his grace." So this is interesting. Now, we shouldn't be looking for praise and for commendation from our superiors or, from our spiritual father. But we must always remember that even when we fulfill all of our obedience and we do everything just the way we were told, because in this case, we see, it says that, Abba Paul was joking when he told them, tie her up and bring her here. But the disciple took it with all sincerity, and because he took it with all sincerity, God helped him. Run down a hyena in the desert, catch it, and bring it to the elder. But the elder protected his spiritual investment by sort of mistreating him and saying, "Fool, why have you brought a silly dog here?" He certainly didn't think he was a fool. He certainly didn't think that what he did was insignificant. He was filled with wonder, we're told, but he didn't show it. And so sometimes maybe if it's not your spiritual father, if it's not your coach or trainer, if it's not your teacher, if it's not your superior, maybe you feel like God himself is saying to you, "Fool, why did you do this?" And sort of smacks you around a little bit, or things don't work out as well. Well, don't be dejected. Don't think for a moment that God doesn't see the progress that you're making. But sometimes God, in order to protect our spiritual investment, in order to protect our spiritual growth, sort of the fruit that we're producing, he allows us to be humiliated a little bit, to be humbled, to sometimes, tempted maybe, so that we do not become proud and lose that which we have acquired through humility. Isaac the Theban. So now this one would be Father Isaac from Thebes. Chapter 1. One day Abba Isaac went to a monastery. He saw a brother committing a sin, and he condemned him. When he returned to the desert, an angel of the Lord came and stood in front of the door of his cell and said, "I will not let you enter." But he persisted, saying, "What is the matter?" And the angel replied, "God has sent me to ask you whether you want to throw the guilty brother whom you have condemned, or you want to throw the guilty brother whom you have condemned." Immediately he repented and said, "I have sinned, forgive me." Then the angel said, "Get up, God has forgiven you. But from now on, be careful not to judge someone before God has done so." Now, this is This is sobering and edifying because we see that he condemned his brother, maybe to his face, maybe only in his heart. And upon returning home to his cell, to his little monastic, place where he lived, the angel of God would not let him enter because he pronounced a condemnation on his brother. And so, next time, before we rush to condemn others, maybe we should remember this and think about the consequences of our actions, that condemning others, we are actually actively damaging and hurting ourselves. Chapter 2. It was said of Abba Apollo that he had a disciple named Isaac, perfectly trained in all good works, and he had the gift of ceaseless prayer at the time of the Eucharist. The time of the Eucharist is basically the part of the liturgy where Holy Communion is consecrated. When he came to the church, he did not allow anyone to join him. He used to say that all things are good in their proper time, for there is a time for everything. And of course, there is a time for everything is the quote from the all-wise king and prophet Solomon. As soon as the synaxis was concluded, he fled as though pursued by fire and hurried back to his cell. So synaxis, basically, that's the Greek word for gathering. So as soon as the common prayer in his monastery was finished, or in the church, that he went to, was finished, he fled as though pursued by fire and hurried back to his cell. The reason for this is because he did not want to be engaged in any idle talk that would undermine the grace that he had received at the time of the Eucharist, at the time of the liturgy. Now at the conclusion of the synaxis, a piece of bread and a cup of wine was often given to the brethren, but he did not accept it. Not that he wanted to refuse the agape of the brethren. He did not want to refuse the love of the brethren. For some reason, they just used the Greek word here, agape, which is love. But because he wished to preserve the ceaseless prayer of the service. So during the service, during the liturgy, he was immersed into ceaseless prayer. He prayed continuously. And he wanted to keep this prayer going. That's why he didn't even receive the bread and wine from the monks, from the fellow monks. He fled right away. Now it happened that he fell ill. When they heard of it, the brethren came to visit him. Sitting beside him, they asked him, Abba Isaac, why do you flee from the brethren at the end of the service? He said to them, I'm not fleeing from the brethren, but from the wicked ruse of the demons. When someone is holding a lighted lamp, if he lingers in the open air, the lamp goes out because of the wind. We are the same if we are illuminated by the Holy Eucharist, the Holy Communion. We linger outside our cell, our spirit is darkened. Such was the way of the life of the holy Abba Isaac. Now, so we see this is a beautiful example of humility and love toward the brethren. He loved the brethren, but he fled from the gathering because he didn't want to lose that grace. And of course, unfortunately, sometimes in our parish life, that happens very quickly because no sooner do we go to communion, we haven't even sometimes had an opportunity to read our prayers of Thanksgiving. We are already engaged in conversations with other people, whether it be in the altar or in the narthex of the church, or sometimes after liturgy when we go downstairs to have fellowship. And fellowship is important. But for us, and perhaps for the laity who are not engaged in ceaseless prayer, the fellowship sometimes gives its own benefit. People stay after liturgy, they talk with like-minded people, they share their faith and sort of their impressions, from their spiritual struggles. They encourage each other, they console each other, and that gives them a tremendous benefit. But for a monastic who had acquired this gift of prayer, for him, fellowship, not just with other people, but even with other monastics, was detrimental. It hindered his prayer, and that is why he fled and went right away, and then sort of tried to get back to his cell. Joseph of Thebes, so another Theban saint. Abba Joseph the Theban said, "Three works are approved in the eyes of the Lord: when a man is ill and temptations fall upon him, if he welcomes them with gratitude. If he welcomes them with gratitude. Secondly, when someone carries out all his works purely in the presence of God, having no regard for anything human. In the third place, when someone remains in submission to a spiritual father in complete renunciation of his own will. This last will gain a lofty crown indeed. As for me, I have chosen illness." So what he's saying is that there are three ways you can acquire virtue and sort of achieve salvation of your soul. One way is when you're ill and temptations befall upon you, to welcome them with gratitude. The other way is to carry out all your works purely in the presence of God. So, and having no regard for anything human, which basically means that you must acquire the continuous memory of God. You must always feel that God is present, whatever you're doing and wherever you're going. That is not an easy task. And then the third one, of course, is to be in submission to a spiritual father, in complete renunciation of his own will. That gives a lofty crown, he says, because, of course, that requires a tremendous effort. Sometimes people erroneously think that being in obedience is a sign of sort of lack of intelligence or lack of mental capacity and ability and capability, that a person who is obedient isn't smart. That's what people sort of think in a worldly way. But in fact, it's anything, but the opposite. It's complete opposite. To be in obedience, you have to be smart. To be in obedience, you have to have strong will. To be in obedience, you have to be very strong spiritually, because you have to cut your own will every single day. And very often it's a tremendous struggle when you are given a particular task, or you are asked to do something. To be obedient means to fulfill it without grumbling, not without understanding. If the spiritual father was leading someone astray, if he were to tell his his disciple to do something that would be soul destroying, then of course it was up to the disciple not to fulfill that type of obedience. However, there is plenty more. There is plenty of space for sort of the demands of obedience that would be considered somewhat extraordinary. I believe, in fact, we even read earlier in the beginning of the book about a saint whose spiritual father put a stick in the ground, just a regular stick, and said, "Water it until it bears fruit." And I think St. John the Dwarf, it was his spiritual father that did that to him. And St. John watered the stick for 3 years. And at the end of 3 years, by God's grace, it rooted itself in the ground, and then it sprang forth branches and leaves and brought forth fruit. Now, the elder collected this fruit, brought it into the church, and said, "Brothers, come and taste the fruit of obedience." Quite literally, because it was just a stick, before it became a tree again, by the prayers of both the elder and the disciple, and by the strenuous labor of the disciple, who had to go quite a distance to get water and to water this stick. So possibly that is why Joseph of Thebes actually says, "Well, I chose illness," meaning that, and it's possible also that the reason he chose illness is that to be in obedience to someone, you had to possess a tremendous amount of physical strength. Because if you're in obedience, you could be given very difficult physical labor. And a sick person is not someone that would be sort of a good candidate for being in obedience. Therefore, Joseph of Thebes, possibly being sick, sort of before, said, well, illness is the path that he chose. Hilarion. From Palestine, Abba Hilarion went to the mountain of Abba Anthony. Abba Anthony said to him, "You are welcome, torch which awakens the day." Abba Hilarion said, "Peace to you, pillar of light, giving light to the world." So this Abba Hilarion obviously was of such a holy life that when he came to St. Anthony called him a torch which awakens the day. And then, Abba Hilarion, of course, called him pillar of light, giving light to the world. So they both praised each other for their, work. And when we hear this, when the saints speak to each other like this, we must understand that they speak in love and humility, and this is no no game with words where they're just trying to, sort of out-praise each other, but they're actually highlighting, maybe sort of naming the virtues or the significance, of each other in this case. And both of them considered the other to be a light to others because of the exemplary spiritual life. Abba Ischyrion, it's spelled in English here, Ischyrion. The Holy Fathers were making predictions about the last generation. They said, "What have we ourselves done?" One of them, the great Abba Ischyrion, replied, "We ourselves have fulfilled the commandments of God." The others replied, "And those who come after us, what will they do?" He said, "They will struggle to achieve half our works." They said, "And to those who come after them, what will happen?" He said, "The men of that generation will not accomplish any works at all, and temptation will come upon them. And those who will be approved in that day will be greater than either us or our fathers." Now, this is something rather significant, and I think that we are certainly living at the sort of the advent of those days that they're talking about. And the reason why is because we are not any better than they are. And of course, quite the opposite. We are absolutely terrible. We haven't done, 1,000th sort of share of their undertakings, of their labors, of their struggles. But we must also consider the difficult and different circumstances that we live in and that they lived in. At the time of their life and struggle, the desert became the city of God. If you went into the desert, you were more likely to find monks there than you would robbers and brigands. Many people in the villages and cities were also God-fearing and lived, according to the gospel. And so the overall social direction was to live a Christian life. Now, in our day and age, we see quite the opposite. Being a Christian, being a believer, forgive me for getting tongue-tied, is a subject, it's a matter of ridicule for some of the people. The current values propagated and supported in our society are against our Christian values. And so even to be an upstanding Christian, just the one who attends church regularly, receives the holy mysteries, and even that, the way of life of so many people nowadays is so immoral that they really shouldn't even be allowed to receive the holy mysteries, because they're, living out of wedlock or committing other sins on an ongoing basis, which would preclude them from receiving Holy Communion. That's becoming more and more widespread. It's becoming the norm. Sin has become the norm. In fact, the days that St. Anthony prophesied about, because I believe St. Anthony the Great said, there will come a time when the overwhelming majority of the people will be spiritually sick, and they will look at a healthy person and say, "You're not like us, you're the one who's sick." And this is what we have arrived at. Essentially, the people around us, the people who are not believers, the people who are not God-fearing, are considering us to be retrograde, renegade, dinosaurs, too old-fashioned, too narrow-minded, too whatever, all the negatives. We are the haters, we are the, narrow-minded, ignorant, unenlightened individuals, which is not the case. We are kind and loving and supporting of everyone who is trying to live a life according to God. But we do not call black white and white black. We do not call evil good or good evil. We try to live according to our conscience. And that in and of itself presents a tremendous effort to be made. Just to live a life like this, not to give in, not to sort of, float downstream along with everyone. That is a great challenge. So we will stop there tonight. God willing, we will continue next week. And we definitely have lots to be grateful for to the Desert Fathers, and there's plenty to think about. However, just as I said today, even though the last Abba said that those coming after, Abba Iskarian said that those coming after would be far greater than the great saints of the ancient times, let us not be conceited. Maybe we're not doing even a very good job of just being Christians. If we did that, and if we did some other labor, maybe we would be, have some hope of being considered great. But we're certainly not doing that. And in many ways, we're failing on a daily basis, failing at even just being Christians. So let us make an effort. Let us strive to have compunction and love for everyone. And God willing, we too, with all the Desert Fathers, will one day inherit the kingdom of heaven by their prayers. God bless. Bye-bye.